He carried the same rifle. He possessed the same skill. He had already proven himself a legend. And yet, in the space of 78 days, Second Lieutenant John George fired his weapon exactly 3 times. Not because he lacked targets. Not because he lost his nerve. But because the war itself had changed beneath his feet. And no one had told him. This is the story of how modern combat made the sniper irrelevant, one silent march at a time. The Winchester Model 70 was, by any standard, a masterpiece. Bolt action, controlled round feed, a Lyman Alaskan scope mounted forward on the barrel. The rifle George carried into Burma in March of 1944 weighed less than 8 pounds. Fitted with an experimental lightweight synthetic stock that made it unnaturally fast to shoulder in the humid crush of jungle warfare. It was a weapon built for patience, for the single perfect shot delivered from concealment at distance. It was a weapon designed for a kind of war that, by the time George reached the Yukon Valley, had already begun to disappear. George was not new to this. For months earlier, on Guadalcanal, he had become something close to myth. In 4 days of combat across the ridgelines and coconut groves of that malarial island, he had killed 11 Japanese snipers. 11. Each shot a calculation. Each kill a small tactical victory that rippled outward, allowing American squads to move, to advance, to survive. The Japanese had mastered the art of the hidden rifleman, turning individual soldiers into terrain features, into psychological weapons that paralyzed entire companies. George had turned that weapon back on them. His reputation preceded him when he joined the Marauders. Men who had never met him knew his name. They knew what he could do. They expected him to do it again. Burma was supposed to be his proving ground. Merrill's Marauders, officially designated as the 5,307th Composite Unit, Provisional, codenamed Galahad, were 3,000 American volunteers tasked with something that sounded simple on a map and impossible on the ground. They would march behind Japanese lines, cut supply routes, disrupt communications, and ultimately seize the airfield at Myakina, a strategic prize that would tilt the entire theater. It was to be a campaign of speed, surprise, and violence. George and his rifle were meant to be the edge. The silent killer who could eliminate officers, machine gunners, observers. The man who could change the math of an engagement before it even began. The first indication that something was wrong came not with gunfire but with silence. The jungle of northern Burma was not like Guadalcanal. The terrain there had been brutal, yes, but it had also offered sightlines. Ridges, open groves, distances that made a rifle like George's relevant. Burma offered none of that. The jungle was a living wall. Vegetation so dense that visibility beyond 50 feet was a luxury. Trees rose 100 feet overhead, their canopy so thick that the forest floor existed in permanent twilight. Vines hung like curtains. Undergrowth clawed at every step. The air itself was a physical presence, thick and wet, the kind of humidity that made every breath feel like drowning. It was a place where sound traveled strangely, where distances collapsed, where the only clear lines of sight were the narrow trails the Marauders followed, single file, hour after hour, day after day. George marched with the column. That was the first problem. Snipers operate from concealment, from positions chosen for advantage, from stillness. George was in motion, always in motion. The Marauders moved fast, covering 10, 15, sometimes 20 miles a day through terrain that fought them at every step. They moved because speed was the doctrine. They moved because staying still in Japanese-held territory meant encirclement, meant becoming the target rather than the threat. The entire operational concept of Galahad depended on mobility. They were not an occupying force. They were raiders. They struck and vanished. They survived by refusing to be pinned down. But a sniper needs to be still. A sniper needs time. Time to read the terrain, to find the position, to wait for the target to present itself. Time to calculate wind, distance, angle. Time to breathe, to settle, to become part of the landscape. George had none of that. He marched. He ate cold rations on the move. He slept in shallow foxholes dug in haste and abandoned at dawn. He carried his rifle slung, not cradled. He moved with the column because the column never stopped moving. The second problem was range. In the jungle, combat happened at distances measured in feet, not yards. The Japanese were not obliging targets standing in open fields. They were close, terrifyingly close. Ambushes erupted from 10 meters. Firefights unfolded at distances where you could see the expression on a man's face before you shot him. The M1 Garand, the standard American infantry rifle, was built for this. Semi-automatic, 8-round N-block clip, .30-06 Springfield. It was not as accurate as George's Winchester at distance, but in the jungle, distance did not exist. What mattered was volume. What mattered was putting rounds downrange, suppressing the enemy, overwhelming their positions with firepower. A man with a Garand could fire 8 shots in the time it took George to cycle his bolt twice. In close-quarters chaos, that difference was everything. George understood this. He was not naive. He had fought on Guadalcanal. He knew what combat felt like. But Guadalcanal had given him opportunities. Burma gave him none. The Japanese in northern Burma were not the exposed snipers of the South Pacific. They were moving to, retreating, harassing, counterattacking. They fought from bunkers, from spider holes, from positions so close that by the time George identified a target, the engagement was already over. The Marauders carried Browning automatic rifles, Thompson submachine guns, mortars, grenades. They carried weapons for close-in brutality. George carried a weapon for surgical precision in a war that had become a brawl. The marches consumed everything. 78 days. More than 700 miles on foot through some of the worst terrain on Earth. The Marauders were dying, but not from bullets. Disease was the real enemy. Malaria, dysentery, typhus, scrub typhus, mite-borne fevers that turned men into shivering wrecks. The unit had started with 3,000 men. By the time they reached Myatkina, fewer than 1,300 were combat effective. The rest were evacuated, dead, or simply too sick to continue but still somehow walking. George watched men collapse mid-march, their bodies surrendering to fevers they had been fighting for weeks. He watched men shit themselves on the trail because dysentery did not care about dignity. He watched the jungle strip away everything except the will to keep moving. He carried his rifle through all of it. 8 pounds. It does not sound like much. But when you have been marching for 6 hours and you have another 6 ahead of you, when your feet are bleeding inside disintegrating boots, when your pack straps have worn grooves into your shoulders, when you have not eaten a hot meal in 3 weeks, 8 pounds becomes a burden. Other men carried more. Of course they did. But their weapons were relevant. George's was becoming an artifact. The first shot came 32 days into the campaign. The Marauders had reached a river crossing, one of the endless muddy tributaries that fed the Irrawaddy system. The Japanese had dug in on the far bank, a platoon-sized element with machine guns covering the ford. It was a straightforward problem. The Marauders could not flank it. The jungle was too dense. They could not call in artillery. There was no artillery. They had to cross, and crossing meant casualties. George saw the opportunity before anyone else did. Across the river, for 112 yards, a Japanese officer was directing fire from a position slightly elevated from the machine gun nests. He was visible only because he had chosen a spot that gave him a clear view of his own men. It was a sniper's dream, a high-value target unaware at a distance where George's rifle was king. He took the shot from a prone position wedged between 2 roots, the rifle barrel resting on a rotting log. The scope picture was clean. The officer was gesturing, animated, focused entirely on the near bank. George controlled his breathing, felt his heartbeat slow, let the crosshairs settle on the man's upper chest. The trigger broke clean. The recoil was sharp but manageable. For 100 yards away, the Japanese officer dropped as though someone had cut his strings. The effect was immediate. The machine gun fire became erratic, confused. The Japanese soldiers on the far bank lost cohesion, lost direction. The Marauders crossed under covering fire and overran the position in minutes. It was the kind of shot that would have made headlines on Guadalcanal. Here, in the chaos of the crossing, most of the men did not even know it had happened. They knew the machine guns had stopped. They did not know why. George felt something then that he would feel again and again over the next 46 days. Relevance. For 60 seconds, his rifle had mattered. For 60 seconds, he had been the weapon he was trained to be. And then the column moved on, and the moment was gone. The second shot came during an ambush south of Shaduzup. The Marauders were strung out along a trail, exhausted, moving in the late afternoon heat when the Japanese hit them from both flanks. It was textbook. The enemy had let the lead elements pass, then opened fire into the middle of the column where the concentration of men was highest. The sound was catastrophic. Rifles, machine guns, grenades, men screaming, men dying. George went to ground with everyone else, his rifle up, scanning for targets. He found one, a Japanese machine gunner, partially concealed behind a fallen tree, maybe 70 yards out. Close range for a sniper, but the man was in a position where the return fire from the Marauders could not reach him. He was killing Americans with impunity. George fired. The Winchester's report was different from the Garand's, sharper, more distinct. The Japanese machine gunner slumped forward over his weapon. But in the seconds after the shot, George heard American voices shouting. Confusion. Someone thought the distinct crack of his rifle was Japanese. Someone else fired in his direction. The bullet hit a tree 2 feet from his head. George flattened himself, yelling his position, identifying himself, waiting for the friendly fire to stop. By the time he could move again, the ambush was over. The Marauders had broken contact, were pulling back, dragging their wounded. George's shot had saved lives. It had also nearly cost him his own. That night, Lieutenant Osborne, one of the platoon leaders, found George near the aid station. Osborne was from Ohio, a schoolteacher before the war, a man who spoke carefully and thought more carefully. He sat down beside George and said nothing for a long time. Then, quietly, he said, "Your rifle sounds wrong." George knew what he meant. In the chaos of an ambush, in the sensory overload of combat, soldiers relied on auditory cues. They knew the sound of their own weapons. They knew the sound of the enemy's. The Winchester did not sound like a Garand. It did not sound like a bar. It sounded like something else, and in the confusion of close combat, something else meant threat. Osborne was not blaming George. He was stating a tactical reality. George's rifle was a liability. The third shot came during the withdrawal from Nkangatong, 51 days into the campaign. The Marauders had been in continuous contact for 4 days. They were falling back toward a defensive position, moving through jungle so thick that the column was strung out over a mile. George was near the rear, moving with a group of stragglers and wounded. They were ambushed by a Japanese patrol, maybe 10 men, maybe fewer, it was impossible to tell. The firing was close, chaotic. George saw a figure moving through the undergrowth, 30 feet away, closing fast. He fired without thinking. The figure dropped. It was not a clean shot. It was not a calculated shot. It was survival. The kind of shot any rifleman could have made with any weapon. The kind of shot that made George's specialized training irrelevant. After that, there were no more shots. Not because there were no more targets. There were. The Japanese were everywhere, probing, harassing, trying to turn the Marauder withdrawal into a rout. But the nature of the contact made George's rifle useless. By the time he could identify a target, acquire it in his scope, settle his breathing, the target was gone or the engagement had moved. The other men, the men with Garands and Bars and Thompsons, they could react. They could fire, displace, fire again. They could put rounds downrange and trust volume to do what precision could not. George could only watch, his rifle ready, waiting for an opportunity that never came. He started to understand something during those last 27 days. The rifle had not failed. He had not failed. The mission had simply evolved past what either of them could offer. Galahad was not a sniping operation. It was not a mission that rewarded patience or long-range marksmanship. It was a forced march interrupted by violence, a continuous test of endurance where the only relevant skills were the ability to keep moving and the ability to put fire on a target before it killed you. George had been training his entire adult life to be something the Burma campaign did not need. The capture of Myakina airfield on May 17, 1944, was the operational objective. The Marauders, along with Chinese forces and British-trained Kachin guerrillas, took the airfield in a surprise assault that succeeded, because the Japanese had not believed anyone could reach it through the jungle. The cost was staggering. Of the 3,000 men who had started the campaign, fewer than 200 were still combat effective by the time the airfield fell. The rest were casualties, medical evacuations, or men so broken by disease and exhaustion that they could no longer function. The unit was effectively destroyed. They had achieved their objective. They had done the impossible, and it had killed them. George survived. He was one of the lucky ones, though luck is a strange word for what he experienced. He had malaria. He had lost 30 pounds. His boots had disintegrated weeks earlier, and he had marched the final days with his feet wrapped in canvas torn from a shelter half. His rifle, the Winchester that had made him a legend on Guadalcanal, was still functional. Still clean, as much as anything could be clean in that place. Still accurate. Still irrelevant. After the war, George wrote about Burma. Not immediately. Took years for him to find the words. When he did, his analysis was cold, precise, unsparing. He did not blame the rifle. He did not blame the Marauders. He blamed the mission design. Or rather, he identified a fundamental mismatch between the operational concept and the tools deployed. Galahad had been a light infantry raid carried out over impossible distances in impossible terrain. The doctrine had prioritized speed and mobility over firepower. The tactics had been shaped by the environment, by the jungle, by the need to keep moving. In that context, the sniper was an anachronism, a specialist optimized for conditions that no longer existed. George understood that his experience on Guadalcanal had created expectations that Burma could never fulfill. On Guadalcanal, the Japanese had been dug in, holding territory, fighting from fixed positions. That created opportunities for snipers on both sides. The Americans had needed someone like George to neutralize the Japanese snipers, to restore mobility to their own infantry. It had been a symmetrical problem with a clear solution. Burma was asymmetrical. The Marauders were the raiders. They were the ones moving, attacking, refusing to be pinned. The Japanese were reacting, retreating, fighting, delaying actions. In that dynamic, the sniper's role inverted. George was not hunting static targets. He was part of a moving column trying to avoid becoming a target himself. The tactical data supported his conclusions. George calculated that during the 78-day campaign, the Marauders had marched more than 700 miles, engaged in 32 separate firefights, and suffered approximately 70% casualties, with disease accounting for the majority. Of those 32 engagements, only one, the river crossing, had presented a target at a distance where a bolt-action rifle offered a decisive advantage over a semi-automatic. In the remaining 31 engagements, the average engagement distance was under 100 yards, with many occurring at less than 50. At those ranges, rate of fire was king. Precision was irrelevant when the enemy was close enough to throw a grenade. George also noted the psychological cost of carrying a weapon that was rarely used. A rifleman with a Garand fired his weapon regularly, sometimes multiple times per engagement. Each shot reinforced training, built confidence, maintained the connection between soldier and weapon. George went days, then weeks, without firing. The rifle became a burden he carried not because it was useful but because it was assigned. He began to resent it. Not the weapon itself, which was blameless, but what it represented. A doctrine that had not caught up with reality. There was another element George identified in his post-war writings, something more subtle but equally important. The nature of modern war was changing in ways that favored volume over precision. The industrial capacity of the United States meant that American forces could afford to expend ammunition at rates that would have been unthinkable in earlier conflicts. The M1 Garand was a symbol of that shift. It was not the most accurate rifle. It was not the lightest. But it was reliable, effective, and it allowed a single soldier to put more rounds downrange than any bolt action could match. That volume created suppression, and suppression created maneuver, and maneuver won battles. The sniper, by contrast, was a precision instrument in an age of mass production. Effective, yes, but limited, unable to scale. The doctrine was already shifting even as George marched through Burma. The U.S. military was learning, adapting, drawing conclusions from thousands of small engagements across multiple theaters. The lessons from the Pacific, from Europe, from North Africa, all pointed in the same direction. Infantry combat in World War II was not about individual marksmanship. It was about squad-level firepower, combined arms, artillery support, air superiority, logistics. The sniper remained relevant but only as a niche capability, a tool for specific situations. Not the centerpiece of infantry tactics but an edge case. George's rifle ended up in a museum. Not immediately. First it went home with him, stored in a closet, cleaned occasionally, never fired. Then, decades later, when military historians began documenting the war's material culture, someone reached out. The Winchester Model 70 with the experimental synthetic stock, carried by 2nd Lieutenant John George through the Burma campaign, was a historical artifact. It represented a doctrinal transition, a moment when warfare changed faster than the weapons designed to fight it. The museum displayed it with a placard that mentioned Guadalcanal, mentioned Burma, mentioned the 3 shots in 78 days. Visitors looked at it and saw a beautiful rifle. They did not see the silence. The story of John George and his rifle is not about failure. George did not fail. The rifle did not fail. They were simply optimized for a war that was already ending by the time they arrived in Burma. The lessons George learned were not about marksmanship or tactics in the narrow sense. They were about the relationship between capability and context, between individual skill and systemic change. George was a master of his craft. His craft had become less relevant. That is not a comfortable conclusion. It suggests that expertise, training, even proven success, can be rendered obsolete by forces beyond individual control. It suggests that wars are not won by heroes but by logistics, doctrine, and the brutal mathematics of attrition. But there is another layer to this. George's experience in Burma taught him something that very few soldiers of his generation understood. He saw the future of warfare, not in the grand strategic sense, not in the geopolitics of the Cold War or the nuclear standoff that would define the next half-century. He saw it in the small details. The way the jungle dictated tactics, the way terrain shaped doctrine, the way the environment determined which weapons mattered and which did not. He saw that modern war was not a test of individual valor but a collision of systems, of industrial capacity against industrial capacity, of doctrine against doctrine. The romantic image of the lone marksman, the skilled individual who could change the course of battle with a single perfect shot, was not wrong. It was simply incomplete. It belonged to a different kind of war. George lived for decades after Burma. He wrote, he taught, he consulted with military historians trying to understand the Pacific War. He never glorified his experience. He never claimed to have been a hero. When people asked him about Guadalcanal, he spoke factually, without embellishment. When they asked about Burma, he was even more clinical. He had been there. He had done what he was trained to do. It had not been enough, and he understood why. That understanding, that willingness to interrogate his own experience without ego, without defensiveness, made him a better analyst than most. The central paradox of George's war is that his greatest success and his greatest frustration came from the same source: his skill. On Guadalcanal, his marksmanship had been exactly what the situation demanded. In Burma, that same marksmanship was irrelevant because the situation had changed. The rifle had not changed. George had not changed. The war had changed. And that is the lesson that extends far beyond World War II, far beyond snipers and rifles and jungle campaigns. It is a lesson about adaptability, about the danger of assuming that what worked before will work again, about the necessity of matching tools to tasks rather than tasks to tools. Modern militaries still train snipers. They remain a valuable capability, particularly in certain operational contexts. Urban warfare, defensive operations, counterinsurgency, all create opportunities for precision marksmanship. But the sniper is no longer the centerpiece. The doctrine has evolved. The emphasis is on combined arms, on integrating multiple capabilities into a coherent system. The individual rifleman, no matter how skilled, is one component among many. George would have understood that. He lived through the transition. The Winchester Model 70 in the museum is a memorial to that transition. It is a beautiful weapon, meticulously crafted, optimized for a task it was rarely allowed to perform. Visitors who see it probably imagine dramatic shots across open terrain. The lone marksman saving his unit with his skill. That happened once at a river crossing in northern Burma. The other 77 days, the rifle was silent. Not because it could not perform, but because the war did not ask it to. That silence is the real story. That silence is what makes the rifle historically significant. George carried that silence with him for the rest of his life. Not as a burden, but as a knowledge. He had been optimized for one kind of war and deployed into another. He had adapted as best he could, had survived, had contributed. But he had also seen his own limitations, had felt what it was like to carry expertise that no one needed. That is a rare and valuable perspective. Most people never confront the obsolescence of their own skills. They live and work in contexts where what they know remains relevant, where their training continues to apply. George did not have that luxury. The war taught him that relevance is contextual, that skill without opportunity is just potential, that the right tool in the wrong place is worse than useless, it is a liability. The physical toll of those 78 days cannot be overstated. When George finally reached Myitkyina, he barely recognized himself. The man who had embarked on the campaign in March had weighed 170 pounds. The man who staggered into the airfield perimeter in May weighed 138. The weight loss was not from lack of eating alone, though rations had been meager and irregular. It was from the constant exertion, the body consuming itself to keep moving. His hands shook when he tried to hold them still. His vision would blur without warning, a side effect of recurring malarial fevers that spiked every few days like clockwork. His feet were a map of infection and injury, blisters that had burst and reformed and burst again, toenails blackened and falling off, the flesh between his toes raw from constant moisture. Every marauder who survived looked like this. They were walking ghosts, men who had pushed beyond what the body was designed to endure and somehow kept functioning. The psychological dimension was equally corrosive. George had trained for years to be a sniper. He had internalized a specific identity, a specific role. He was the man who solved problems that others could not. He was the specialist, the expert, the one whose unique skills justified his place in the unit. In Burma, that identity had been systematically dismantled. Day after day of carrying a weapon he could not use. Day after day of watching other men do the work that mattered while he simply marched. There is a peculiar kind of frustration that comes from being capable but irrelevant, from knowing you could contribute if only the circumstances were different. George felt that frustration daily. It was not anger exactly. It was closer to grief. The grief of watching your purpose dissolve. He spoke with other specialists during the campaign, men who had trained for roles that Burma did not need. There was a combat engineer named Kozlowski who had expertise in demolitions, in bridge construction, in obstacle clearing. Kozlowski had spent 3 years learning his craft. In Burma, there were no bridges to build. The Marauders forded rivers or bypassed them. Obstacles were cleared with machetes and brute force, not with careful demolition. Kozlowski carried his blasting caps and det cord for 78 days and used them once, to destroy a Japanese supply cache that was already abandoned. He and George recognized something in each other, a shared understanding that training and reality had diverged. There was also a radio man named Petrucelli, a kid from Brooklyn who could operate any communications equipment the Army possessed. He could troubleshoot malfunctions, jury-rig repairs, maintain signal integrity under impossible conditions. In Burma, the radios failed constantly. The humidity destroyed circuits. The batteries died. The jungle terrain blocked signals. Petrucelli spent most of his time carrying a dead radio, keeping it clean and dry and ready for the moment when it might work again. That moment came rarely. When it did, the messages were brief, often garbled, and usually rendered obsolete by the time they were received. The Marauders operated in a communications vacuum. They moved based on their own initiative, their own judgment, their own mistakes. Petrucelli's expertise could not overcome physics. These men, George and Kozlowski and Petrucelli and others like them, represented a doctrinal assumption that had not survived contact with the Burma jungle. The assumption was that specialized skills would be force multipliers, that experts in narrow fields would provide decisive advantages. That assumption was correct in many contexts. In Burma, it was wrong. What the Marauders needed was not specialists but generalists. Men who could march, shoot, dig, carry, endure. Men whose value came from baseline competence across multiple domains rather than exceptional ability in one. The campaign rewarded versatility, punished specialization. George noticed something else as the campaign progressed. The men who thrived, if that word can be applied to any survivor of that nightmare, were not the most skilled marksmen or the most tactically sophisticated. They were the men who could regulate their own suffering. The men who could pace themselves on the marches, who could eat when they had no appetite, who could sleep in conditions that made sleep seem impossible. The men who could endure discomfort without letting it break their focus. This was not a glamorous skill. It was not something that got you promoted or decorated. But it was the skill that mattered most. George had it. He survived. But he also recognized that it had nothing to do with his training as a sniper. It was something deeper, some quality of character or physiology that determined whether a man could be broken by continuous hardship. The rifle itself became an object lesson in the gap between ideal and real. The Winchester Model 70 was a precision instrument. It required maintenance. In the jungle, maintenance was nearly impossible. George cleaned the weapon whenever he could, but there were days when he could not. Days when the column was moving so fast that stopping for any reason meant falling behind, meant risking separation from the unit. Days when his hands were shaking too badly from fever to disassemble the bolt. Days when there was simply no clean water to use for the barrel, and the alternative was leaving it fouled. The rifle accumulated dirt, moisture, microscopic particles of vegetation. The scope, which George had protected obsessively, still developed a faint fog on the interior lens surfaces, condensation that could not be removed without disassembling the entire optic. The rifle still fired. It was still accurate, but it was degrading, slowly, inevitably victim of an environment it had never been designed for. The irony was not lost on George. He had been issued a rifle with an experimental lightweight synthetic stock precisely because someone, somewhere in the supply chain, understood that weight mattered in jungle warfare. That innovation had worked. The synthetic stock had saved perhaps 2 pounds compared to a traditional walnut stock. Those 2 pounds mattered on the marches. But the innovation had addressed a secondary problem while ignoring the primary one. The primary problem was not the weight of the rifle. It was whether a bolt-action precision weapon had any place in close-quarters jungle combat. The army had optimized the wrong variable. After the war, when George taught marksmanship and tactics to a new generation of soldiers, he returned again and again to this theme. Optimize for the mission, not for the weapon. Understand the environment before you select the tools. Do not fall in love with equipment. The weapon is subordinate to the task. These lessons, learned at such cost in Burma, became foundational to his teaching. His students, most of whom had never heard of Merrill's Marauders, absorbed the principles without understanding where they came from. They became better soldiers because George had learned, the hard way, what mattered and what did not. The Marauders who survived Burma carried their own lessons forward. They had learned that the human body has limits, that disease kills more surely than bullets, that victory can feel indistinguishable from defeat when you are too sick and exhausted to care. They had learned that the jungle is an enemy more implacable than any human force, that terrain is not just a backdrop but an active participant in combat. They had learned that mobility and firepower matter more than individual heroics, that the unit survives through collective action, not individual brilliance. George's lesson was more specific but equally profound. He had learned that the weapon does not make the soldier, the mission makes the weapon relevant. If you are still here, if this story has made you think about the relationship between skill and context, between technology and tactics, between what we prepare for and what we actually face, then you have understood something important. Wars are not fought in the abstract. They are fought in specific places, under specific conditions, with specific tools. The mismatch between those elements is where history is made. George and his rifle were a mismatch. That mismatch taught lessons that the U.S. military absorbed and applied. It shaped doctrine for the next generation. It made future soldiers more effective because George and others like him were willing to report honestly on their own limitations. If this story changed how you think about warfare, about adaptation, about the way progress renders even recent innovations obsolete, let me know in the comments below. And if you found value in this deep dive into a forgotten corner of the Pacific War, consider subscribing. There are more stories like this, more moments where the machinery of war collided with human experience in unexpected ways, more lessons buried in the archives waiting to be told. Hit the like button if you want to see more long-form history that does not simplify, that does not glorify, that tries to understand what actually happened and why it mattered. And here is a question for you. In modern warfare, where technology advances faster than ever, how do we train soldiers for wars we cannot yet imagine? How do we balance specialization with adaptability? That is the question George's experience poses, and it has not been answered. Maybe you have thoughts on that. I would be interested to hear them.